Good morning to everyone on the West Coast, and good afternoon to everyone on the East Coast. Thank you for joining us today on our webinar on Quarterly Board Reporting Checklist. This is Marty Dzur of Dzur Compliance Consulting. I serve as the Chief Compliance Officer for IMST and IMST2. This webinar is a joint effort between MFAC and Dzur Compliance Consulting. Our panelists today are Amy from MFAC, who will be discussing the new PDF format of the Quarterly Board Book Reporting Checklist, and Heather from Dzur Compliance Consulting, who will be discussing some of the questions from the checklist that we typically see issues with. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please type them in the question box on the webinar control panel. As time permits, the panelists will answer your questions at the end of the presentation. If we do not get to your question during the webinar, we will contact you separately. To begin, Amy will discuss the new checklist format.
Thank you, Marty. So beginning this month, the Quarterly Board Book Reporting Checklist has a new format. In an effort to improve upon the quarterly reporting process to the board and to make it easier for you, the advisor, to meet with compliance requirements, we have revamped the checklist to be a fillable PDF form. We are continually striving to improve our operational processes and are always open to suggestions, so please do not hesitate to reach out to us with your ideas. Today I'm going to briefly walk through the new checklist format and highlight areas of change. The first thing I want to note is that any language revisions that we made to the questions were for clarification purposes only and were not material. Also, while we have removed one or two questions due to redundancy, we did not add any new questions at this time. So once you open the checklist, you will first see a cover page. Just as before, there will be a list of your funds as of the most recent quarter end. You will also see the names and contact information of your representatives at both MFAC and Dzur Compliance Consulting, who will be able to assist you if you have any questions while you're completing the checklist. As you navigate through the following pages, simply click on the check boxes to answer each question. Most of the questions have a comment box below each question. This gives you the opportunity to make a comment to us at MFAC or to Marty about the question or your response, independent of whether your response is yes or no. Similar to the previous checklist format, you may be required to provide additional written explanation depending on how you respond to certain questions. If your response requires an explanation, an additional text box will appear once you have made your choice. You should include your explanation in this box, not the comments box. So I will use the question on this slide as an example. The question is, did the fund or funds engage in any soft dollar transactions? If you have no soft dollar transactions to report for the quarter, you would check no and move on to the next question. If you check yes, additional text boxes will appear that you will need to complete directly in the form. You will need to answer A, were all the services purchased with soft dollars within the safe harbor provided by Rule 28E. B, has or have the funds received reasonable value for the services purchased with soft dollars relative to the amount paid, and then enter the details of your transactions. You will also see that there is a red border around some of the text boxes. This indicates that this is a required field and must be filled out in order to submit your checklist. And we will discuss the submission of your checklist a little bit later in the webinar. For this soft dollar reporting question, you can see that there are only enough lines embedded in the form to report 3 soft dollar transactions. We do, however, realize that sometimes you will have more than 3 transactions to report. In that case, we have included a separate form that you can use to report all of your transactions. Just double-click on the Appendix A soft dollar report file listed in the attachment section, save it down to your computer's directory, and attach it to the email once you are ready to submit the entire checklist. As another example, question 11 asks if there have been any changes to your firm's ownership, control persons, or principal executive officers. Please review the list thoroughly and indicate if there have been any changes throughout the quarter. If there have been changes, click yes. and you will be given a space to indicate those changes. This question is a prime example of why it is important to use the most recent version of the checklist that we send to you each quarter. Any changes that you have requested in a prior quarter are implemented the following quarter. It is very important that you are certifying the correct individuals as owners, control persons, and principal executive officers of your firm. In particular, any changes in ownership need to be reported to MFAC and Marty immediately. Our final example is question 20, which asks, at any time during the quarter, did any compliance violations occur? If the answer is yes, then a text box will appear requiring you to provide an additional explanation. We want to note that when you are responding to this question, you should not be reporting any Code of Ethics violations. There is a separate Code of Ethics certification form that you fill out on a quarterly basis where you should include your Code of Ethics violations. Only report violations of your fund's portfolio holdings that violate the prospectus disclosure, 1940 Act limitations, and/or IRS regulations. And all of the rest of the questions in the form follow this same structure as the examples we have provided. You can save the checklist onto your directory at any time if you need to work on it in multiple sittings using the Save button on the last page. Once you have completed the checklist, you are then ready to sign the document and submit. We are accepting digital signatures now, so there is no need to print out the checklist to sign them. And then once you have signed and dated the checklist, you will click on the Submit button. After clicking on the Submit button, a box will pop up asking how you would like to send the email. You can choose to send the email through Outlook, which is the default application, or your preferred webmail provider. Once you have made a selection, a draft email will be generated pre-filled with the recipient addresses. And the purpose of the pre-filling of the recipient addresses is to ensure that your checklists are getting into the hands of the right parties. Once the draft email is generated, you can include any other attachments you are required to submit, including your additional soft dollar transactions, revised compliance manuals if you indicated changes, revised ADVs, etc. Currently, most sub-advisors' checklists are set up so that the materials will email directly to MFAC and Desura Compliance Consulting. If your fund has a sub-advisor, please communicate with your sub-advisors regarding reviewing their materials prior to submitting to us. Going forward, we will include the advisor's email address in the pre-filled address line for each of the sub-advisors. If you hit the Submit button and receive an error message, it means that there is a required field somewhere in your checklist that was not completed. The error message will indicate which questions still need to be addressed. So in the example on your screen, the error message tells me that question 20 was not completed and that the form was not signed or dated. Once you have gone back and completed those parts, the document will then allow you to submit. And lastly, I want to go over a few bugs that were discovered in the most recent version of the checklist that went out. Now, this really only applies to the IMST advisors who just received their checklist. These issues are currently being worked on and will be fixed prior to your next round of requests. First, if you respond yes to any question, but after further discussion need to change your response to no, please uncheck the yes box first before changing your answer. This removes the additional text box that appeared requiring an explanation and helps ensure that you're able to submit the checklist with no issues. Secondly, as opposed to all of the other questions, answering yes to questions 19, 34, and 35 does not require an additional explanation. However, currently, a required text box appears. Please put not applicable in that text box so that you can submit the form. If you respond no to any of those three questions, please do leave an explanation in the comments box. We truly appreciate everyone's patience as we work through these minor bugs. We hope that these examples have helped you to become a little more comfortable with the new checklist format. If you have any questions while you are completing the checklist, please do not hesitate to reach out to me or any of your contacts at MFAC, and we would be more than happy to assist you. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Heather, who is going to go over some questions that we commonly have issues with. Heather?
Thanks, Amy. You may notice that some of the compliance questions ask for more than one supporting document when you select the answer that requires an explanation or comment. I will go through a few example questions that we commonly have to follow up on with an advisor if the requested detail is not provided. For questions number 16 and number 17, which ask about changes to your policies and procedures and code of ethics, we ask that you provide a redline version of your updated policies and procedures or code of ethics and for a summary of the changes. The summary is very important since it helps us to easily identify any material changes you have made versus when you've just rearranged certain sections or language. The material changes need to be reported to and sometimes approved by the board. One question that some advisors inaccurately answer from quarter to quarter is number 18 regarding regulatory exams. Until an exam is concluded, you should be providing an update each quarter, even if it is simply to say that there have been no additional contacts with the SEC, FINRA, or other regulatory agencies. Also, please remember to contact both DZOR Compliance Consulting and MFAC once you are contacted by a regulator informing you of a review or exam. As our last example, we look to question number 30, which asks about any ADV changes during the quarter. Almost all changes to the ADV Part 1 and Part 2 during the year are material and should be included in the checklist. Since any material changes to the ADV Part 2 are summarized in the brochure, we're able to use that to summarize your changes. However, sometimes an advisor will only make changes to its ADV Part 1 and will provide that updated ADV without a summary of the changes. We ask that you remember to provide a summary, especially if you only made changes to your ADV Part 1, since there is no way to determine your changes unless we compare your updated ADV to the previous one line by line. A redline version of the ADV Part 1 is also available on your firm's IARD account and may be provided to confirm the changes that you made to your ADV. Those are just a few examples of the questions that we typically have to follow up on. I would also like to discuss the importance of completing and submitting the quarterly checklist by the deadline. These checklists are used to complete various service provider reports to the board, including the quarterly CCO report, and we have deadlines set by the board, which we have to submit our reports. Late submissions can hold up this process and may be required to be reported to the board. So to summarize, please remember to submit your checklist by the deadline, thoroughly read through each question, and provide all of the requested supporting documentation for each question. I will now turn it back over to Amy to go over any questions that came in during the presentation.
Great, thank you, Heather. So the first question we have is, am I able to request an extension to complete my checklist? Marty, do you want to take that one?
Sure, thanks, Amy. If you find that you need additional time to complete your checklist, please be sure to contact MFAC, Heather, or I right away. As Heather mentioned, these checklists are used by various service providers to prepare reports for the quarterly meeting of the Board of Trustees. It helps us to know the checklist is going to be late, so everyone can plan ahead. We have set due dates for the meeting materials, and anything received late could delay our reporting and thus lead us to have to report to the board of your delay. This goes for all board materials that we request from you.
Thank you, Marty. The next question we have is, I have received feedback from MFAC on my quarterly checklists in the past and have been asked to revise the checklist that I sent. Why is that? Does the board actually see our completed checklist? Heather, I think maybe you can answer this one.
Sure. So the Board of Trustees does not actually see the completed checklist, but as Marty and I both stated, the information is summarized and used to prepare board reports. More importantly, it's important to note that your completed checklist becomes part of fund record and is subject to regulatory examination. This is why we come back to you to revise your response if we notice that a question was incorrectly answered. For example, if you respond that you had no trade errors during the quarter, but it's later discovered that you actually did have a trade error and the SEC discovers this, they may come back to you for an explanation as to why you did not properly report your error. So ensuring that these checklists are properly completed helps ensure that the board will receive accurate reports and helps minimize discrepancies in the fund records.
Okay, great. Thanks, Heather. The last question I have here is, I have the same soft dollar arrangements that occur every quarter. Can I use a previous form so that I do not have to re-enter the transactions every quarter? In this case, if your soft dollar arrangements have not changed from the prior quarter, you're more than welcome to use the Appendix A soft dollar report from the previous quarter. Once you respond yes to the question, just write "See attached" in the red outlined text box that appears. You can also include your own form of soft dollar report as long as it contains all of the pieces of information we have requested on our form. So it looks like that's all of the questions that we have today, and I will turn it back over to Marty to conclude our webinar.
Those are some good questions, Amy. First, I'd like to thank Amy and Heather, our panelists. Also, thank you to all the advisors and sub-advisors for joining us today. We know that everyone is very busy. We hope that the improvements, as well as the new revamped checklist in the PDF fillable format, will make it easier for you with the quarterly reporting process to the board. If you have any additional questions, please contact any of the panelists or me. Also, you'll be asked to complete a short survey on today's webinar to help us on conducting future webinars. Thank you again for your time today. We look forward to you joining us at the next webinar.